Chris, I would like to thank you so much for coming to talk to us. Chris Oxborrow is a psychotherapist and trainer, and she works, her work is focused on supporting high achieving individuals, which I've not met one dentist who doesn't actually drop into that category. And I think I would probably put my hand up as well. So I'm really fascinated with what you're going to be talking about, because you're going to be discussing high achieving individuals and the issues surrounding those, and just really how to make the most of it and how to get the best out of it. So, well, first of all, why do you think people in dentistry are drawn to this profession? Do you think it's personality driven?
I think that's a really interesting question, because there's obviously going to be exceptions to the rule. However, I think that if you look at a lot of the professions that challenge people to achieve highly, to do well, probably right from the word go in terms of academia, dentistry definitely falls into that category. And so what we recognize is that people tend to self-select for those professions. So you'll often find that either the profession itself or the specialty within that profession often sees an interesting similarity of personality across the board. So it might be that you find that there's a lot of dentists that are quite similar to one another in terms of personality and traits.
Really similar. You go to a dental conference and like half of the dentists, they're all the same.
And then there might be people that fall into specialty categories as well, where you might be able to see almost like the Venn diagram effect. There's people that then kind of almost specialize and look a little bit more, or sound a little bit more, or seem a little bit more like each other. And it's not about boxing ourselves, it's just about understanding how our personality tends to self-select for the professions that we choose. You think how much of our profession we spend time, our lives in. It's important that we feel satisfied.
So what do you think people are looking for when they go into dentistry? What's the personality thing that's driving them towards that kind of career?
Well, this is why my job's so satisfying, because that's a narrative that everybody has, isn't it? And I'm fascinated in narratives. So I would be really interested to hear individual stories around what draws people into those professions. But if we took groups of people and thought about what their personality types might be, then it would be that high achieving perspective. People who actually highly value achievement. They highly value the drive and the level of motivation that's required to not just achieve those grades to get into dentistry school, for example, but also to manage a business. Because I remember when you and I talked after you'd left university and you just started your dentistry career, and you said to me, I realise now that I'm not just a good dentist, I'm a good businesswoman.
I didn't have any ego then, did I?
Well, listen, maybe that's another part of the trait. It's not about being egotistical. It's about being able to say, I'm good at this, and actually this is why I'm going to do it, and this is what I want to achieve out of it. So that drivenness has to have a certain amount of personal recognition in it.
So how would you actually define a high achiever then?
Well, I suppose people who do highly value success and achievement, and who tend to be driven to accomplish it. And they're often hard workers, because the reality is I don't think achievement ever doesn't require hard work. But from the outside to those people who maybe don't put themselves in that category, they might look like they find it easy. But we know that high achievers are still hardworking, and also that there's a lot that goes with that in terms of pressure and expectation as well.
It's I've had said to me many times in my career, oh, you're really lucky. And I remember, I don't really say it to their faces, but I say, there ain't no luck in this. This is just all massive hard work and hours and hours. And then sometimes they say, oh, no, you must be really clever to do that. And I'm not even sure I'm very clever, because it's just like the volume of work and effort and focus. And then the older I get, I think I work harder and faster and more focused than I've ever worked. So you tend to achieve more now than you did before.
Yeah, but I can hear a tinge of imposter syndrome in there as well.
Oh, really?
Maybe just in terms of
this is like an open therapy session. This is great.
Just in terms of kind of like, I know it's not luck, it's hard work, but actually, what about your qualities that actually, aren't about luck, and they're not about hard work? They genuinely are about this, and not to make you uncomfortable or to cringe, but this dynamic, charismatic person that brings herself with passion to the work that she does. But we're not the first people to actually say that about ourselves very often. We focus on what sounds more palatable to other people. I just work really hard.
So what sort of specific traits do high achievers have? Because I think that's quite interesting in helping us understand ourselves, isn't it?
Yeah. I think, if people recognize this in themselves, then fine. If they don't, then it's okay. We're not trying to box people here. Yeah. But in terms of high achievers, perfectionism or tendency to perfectionism probably has to come pretty high up on the scale there. And one of the things I frequently say to people is, we're not pathologizing this. If I said to you earlier, didn't I? If you Google perfectionism, there's a whole load of negativity around it, and I would say that that's when it falls into clinical perfectionism, where actually we start to psychologically struggle, and we can talk about that later if it comes up. But in terms of our tendency to perfectionism, you can spin that if you want. It's a drive to excellence, and there's some incredible benefits in it. And to be honest, I want my dentist to be somewhat of a perfectionist. I want my doctor and I want my lawyer, if he's standing in court for me, and I want my pilot who's flying me on holiday to be perfectionists. I want my banker to be too, to look after every single penny of mine. We definitely see this self-selection for certain professions, and we want them. But the important recognition for those of us that have these traits is, what pressure does it put us under, and how does it impact us in our lives? But I suppose, so there's perfectionism, and then there's that drive that we were talking about. And the interesting thing about the drive is that a high achiever might not actually get any satisfaction if they're not being driven. So I don't know how many people within the dentistry industry who probably would get quite bored if they didn't have the next thing.
Well, I think lockdown was a perfect example, wasn't it? The first couple of weeks into lockdown, everybody that I know, we were all going into overdrive. It wasn't a holiday. It was just like a massive period to self-develop. And then you had to really focus on actually just calming down and pretending it was a holiday just for a week or two, just because it had been so stressful up to then. So and the enormous amount of things that dentists have been doing in that period about learning and training and webinars and doing so many different things and launching new
and all of that crazy stuff that you're going to have to do when you go back again. And again, you're back to that thing of, it might look easy to other people, but actually you are working really hard behind the wings to get yourself prepared to provide and deliver a service of excellence that you can be proud of. And the interesting thing is, often, that perfectionism that drives high achievers, however excellent those outcomes are, they probably never feel quite perfect enough. High achievers tend to move the goalposts on themselves quite regularly.
All right, yeah.
If I've achieved that, probably wasn't a high enough achievement in the first place. So, got to stretch it a bit more. What's the next thing that I can really achieve? And you said, what else? I mean, I think demanding and high achievement related lifestyles in general. So we're talking about self-selecting for professions, but people also self-select their social lives, they self-select their forms of exercise, they self-select for even creativity. It will tend to probably be production based. What can I see that's come out of this that I can judge whether or not it's good enough, and how do I improve it? So PBs within exercise are really, really commonplace.
Yeah, absolutely. And things like relaxing by doing competitive triathlons and things.
Yeah, which I would call the lean out technique in terms of self-care. You know, there's externalized, how do I look after myself, but it's always quite external, it's always quite evaluative based, you know. And one of the things I was trying to get high achievers to think about during lockdown is actually, how do you learn to lean in? Because a lot of those lean out techniques that we've been using have been stolen from us. They've been hijacked by the situation. We can't go to the pub, we can't go out on bikes with other groups of people, you know, we can't, you know, and I really mean, you know, cycling, not just biking like some people have been doing for exercise, you know, but you know, that kind of triathlons type training with other people, you know, it's been much harder, hasn't it? So how do we lean in? How do we take better care of ourselves?
So for this group of high achievers, which I appear to have landed right in the middle of,
smack bang in the middle.
what are there any predispositions to burnout?
Yeah, I think this is when you Google perfectionism, this is when you start to see that shadow side. So, and this is why I call it a shadow side, because I really want high achievers to hear that we're not saying that there's something wrong with their personality or there's something wrong with their tendencies. What we're saying is, in times of stress, and especially chronic stress, you know, when it doesn't change, it just continues for lengths of time, and it's almost unchangeable and out of our control. And sometimes also if we experience trauma, those characteristic, those natural tendencies can shift into that shadow side. So we can see a bit more of the clinical perfectionism, when actually what happens is that we become so focused and over-evaluated on achievement that nothing is ever good enough, and we become really quite internally self-critical of ourselves, and that can create psychological distress and even mental health problems, actually, you know. But low self-esteem.
So what are the signs that we're looking out for that we or our colleagues are getting close to burnout?
So yeah, so I suppose one of the things I would encourage high achievers to do is do a bit of that lean in stuff. Really get to know yourself, really understand what it is that makes you tick. Because if I were to think about it, it would be interesting to see what you would say. If I would know I was starting to really get overstretched when I'm procrastinating. So procrastination is a real sign of starting to allow that shadow side to take over. So it's not just, oh, I'll put that off till tomorrow because I'm a bit tired today. That's not really what I'm talking about. I'm talking about looking at something and saying, I can't start that because it won't be good enough. And everybody will kind of go, what's that? And why are you even bothering? And then I can't even get started on it. It's better for me to not do it at all than to do it and it not feel good enough. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
And
no.
I think the self-esteem side is really important to recognize, you know, what is your internal voice saying to you? Because we all have a bit of a self-critical internal voice from time to time, don't we? Oh, stupid.
Some of us more than others.
In fact, I was listening to a YouTube talk around perfectionism and the imposter syndrome the other day, and this woman was saying, you know, if I could get a megaphone to announce what you say to yourself in your head, everybody would be appalled. You wouldn't speak to anybody else like that, you know. And it's true, isn't it? We get quite cruel on ourselves, and this is, I think, where we start to recognize that internal self-critic can become the imposter, especially for high achievers, because imposter syndrome is, many of us will have heard of it. It's a term that's being used a lot at the moment, but it's when we become quite fixated on the idea that our success isn't really real success, that the next time we try anything, it will be found out to be the fraud that we believe we are. And so we're constantly trying to hide that and work harder or silence the internal critic. So yeah, I think when we start to really hear that voice that is having a go, I won't ask you personally because it might be a little bit, but I'll disclose my.
I know this is getting into, this is fun.
My imposter says, anybody, there's loads of people out there that can do it better than you. Why would they want to hear you say it?
Yeah.
And she was talking quite loud before this talk.
Yeah.
Yeah. You'll fluff it up, you'll say it all badly, it'll come across really rubbish and nobody will get it. And I said to you a little bit earlier, does that make sense? That's my imposter going, it didn't make sense what you just said.
It did, honestly, it did make sense, trust me.
Yeah, thanks.
I think ways that I've learned to counteract that is, I always say to myself, first 10 of anything is you're going to mess up. Messing up just means that you're going to make a mistake, which means you're going to learn from it. Like on number 11, if you're still making mistakes like that, well, you need to really, shape up, get training, or forget it. If it's not going to work. So I did. Start of lockdown, my favorite bread shop was closed, and so I started doing sourdough bread, and the first one just looked like poo. It was just really bad. And
was it edible?
And well, if there was nothing else on the table, I would eat it, but only close. And so my son, he took a photograph of it, and he said, and he like Instagrammed it to his friends. He said, 10 out of 10 for effort, mother, which was just like so sarcastic. And he said, why do you keep doing it? And like every day I was making another loaf, and they were all really bad. And I said, well, imagine if I was a Michelin star chef, how many loaves of bread would they make before they became a Michelin star bread making chef? And I said, what, maybe 5,000? So I said, I'm on number 1. So, let's just keep going. So it's, I think.
Yeah, this is the beautiful counteraction, isn't it? Counter challenge to our internal self-critic is to actually give ourselves permission not to be perfect. Yeah. Because what we have to recognize is that perfectionism, despite the fact that we're talking about it as a trait, when it becomes a clinical issue, we have to remember that actually it never was possible in the first place. So although we might talk about tendencies to perfectionism, what we're saying is that drive then creates excellence. Yes. It's never perfection. So it's a lovely counteract to that perfectionist approach, isn't it? Actually, you're going to get this wrong before you get it right, and that's okay.
Yeah.
And
because that's just learning, isn't it? You have to learn to be able to improve, and if you don't dare try, then how are you ever going to be amazing?
And despite the fact that our mistakes can be excruciating, actually they're probably the biggest leaps that we can do to make up, to move forward. Because if we're not making, I remember somebody saying to me that the way that you do a sport, so whichever sport is the way that you live your life. And I can remember thinking, oh no, because I just started rock climbing and I wouldn't trust the rope. And so I would climb all the way up these climbs, and people would go, God, that was really good. You didn't fall off once. Like, no, because I fell off, I'd have to trust the rope. I want to be able to do it perfectly, so I don't need the rope. By the way, I do this job because I absolutely understand why people experience perfectionism, because I've learned that I am also a perfectionist, but perhaps not in the high achiever category, because I'm too messy. I'm too messy about it, and I procrastinate too much. But I get
takes the whole world. It's good. So how can we equip ourselves to be as mentally tough as we can be?
Yeah. And I think you and I talked, didn't we, about this phrase mental toughness, and because it's a word that helps people perhaps understand better the concept of resilience. But what's important to realize sometimes is that when we use any of these words, they make us think strength. And I think sometimes when we are our strongest, we are our most flexible, not rigid and unchanging and concrete in our thinking.
So just talk me through that one again. When we're at our strongest, we're the most flexible.
Yes. So in other words, it's not about being rigid. So imagine the idea of a branch compared to a reed, a piece of grass. At some point when we're rigid, we can break. But if we're flexible, we can move with the changes. And I think that what happens with rigid thinking, we can sometimes find in perfectionism and the all or nothing thinking that perfectionism sometimes develops, is the idea that something has to be a particular way or it's no good at all.
Yeah.
And if you can start to develop something around a flexibility of expectation, a flexibility of expectation of yourself and situations, then you can ride those storms, you know, of change or of things not going quite right. You know, we all know, don't we, those little moments where something's not quite right and we want to redo it, and you know, they're so irritating, aren't they? A lot of our lives are out of that control. We can't redo it, or we can't even make that happen that way. That's where the perfectionist or the, you know, that kind of all or nothing thinking can cause us to stumble.
Yeah.
So I loved your, you know, you have a way of counteracting that in the way that you say it's never going to be perfect first time. And then there's another way of thinking. It's saying, how do I be flexible in this moment? But for me, this all starts with self-awareness. It's getting to know how you tick. Because if you just go in sort of thinking, right, this is what I need to be able to achieve in this moment, you haven't done any prep to thinking, well, what is it that I need to cope in this moment? You know, what is it that is going to build me to be a resilient individual? And also, how do I work, how do I function in the relationships that I have with others as well? Because I think that's really important. It doesn't really matter what our personalities are. They will always have an impact on other people. And I think that's something really worth being reflective about as well.
It's been such a period of change over the past, well, it's going to be easy 6 months, if not 12 months by the time we've come out of it. And I think we can see around us, and you know, in our teams and in ourselves, just the stress that change brings. Are there any practical tools that, or ideas that you can give us to try and develop this flexibility so that it's not as stressful?
I think we kind of mentioned that lean in, lean out stuff, didn't we, earlier on? So for the period of time we're in at the moment, where our lives are somewhat restricted and out of our control, one thing I would ask people to do is really be aware of what it does to you when you feel a bit out of control. So I've had lots of conversations during the lockdown period with people in therapy with me and just outside generally, that actually it's brought about coping mechanisms that aren't always healthy for us. So I know a lot of people whose eating has gone completely out of sync. Maybe for those who've got a past of maybe eating disorder, you know, that it's kind of almost like it's come back again. You know, people who are really falling back into your old habits of not taking care of themselves. And you know what, for the high achievers, that might be the driven approach. You know, the shadow side of our drive becomes actually quite obsessive and we can't let stuff go. So it's not just about losing sight of things and not doing stuff. It can be a commissive thing. We do stuff that actually can be quite unhelpful for us. So back to that awareness again, really. But when we're thinking about going into situations where we're back into teams and we're back into, when we're dealing with family, when we come home as well, God, communication, you know, talk. Because you know what the imposter syndrome does is it silences us with shame, because we believe that we're not good enough, and so we need to hide that. So we don't talk, we try and resolve, and sometimes we get ourselves in a tangle. I think sometimes find somebody, whether it's a mentor or a friend or a therapist or a coach, find somebody to talk this out with. Get that shame out, because you know what? It just eats away at us and it changes our behavior and it changes our decisions, and actually it restricts our success. So I think that openness of communication, if we can bear to do it with our teams, because I got the feeling from talking to you that dental teams are quite a close-knit group, aren't they?
Very close-knit, yeah. They tend to be quite small, maybe under 15.
Yeah, and you get close to people and people get to know who you are. But it also means that you're in each other's inner circles sometimes. So that means that you impact each other too. And so if there are issues that arise, a bit like in families, you know, they grate more than perhaps those distant office type relationships where you don't overlap so much. So yeah, communication and just, I think, really starting to focus on a self-care routine. during lockdown, when I asked doctors that I was working with on the front line, what's your self-care routine? It's such a therapist lingo thing to say. And they kind of went, oh, what's that? What's one of those? And it's like, oh,
Cup of tea.
A cup of tea, glass of wine, I think was probably more the, but you know, there wasn't any determined structure to it. And I think that, you know, you raised an issue that we mentioned. If you practice something to stay physically healthy, why would you not practice it to stay healthy in your well-being as well? And when we say a practice, we really do mean a practice. What do you do every day that focuses in and takes care of you? And you know what, I come across so many people in high achieving medical professions that think that kind of stuff almost feels a bit namby-pamby or
it's for someone else, isn't it?
Okay. Yeah.
It's for someone else who really needs it, isn't it?
And the phrase that often used is, I shouldn't have to need that. You know, that's what we high achievers sometimes, or perfectionists sometimes say, oh, I shouldn't have to need that. Well, actually, we all need it, you know, because that's the key to not burning out, is to catch it before. It's a maintenance approach, not a safety net or rescue approach. Yeah, it's great to have those things in place. Let's definitely have safety nets when people slip up or drop down or struggle. But actually, what's going to maintain you, you know, to keep you healthy?
So thinking about teams, I know we've been starting, dentists have been starting back to work over the last few weeks. The stress within the team, I mean, I've got an amazing team, but you know, you can see everybody's stresses are way harder than they would be normally, and it just builds and builds, and you know, everybody's just more on edge and finding it more difficult to work as a team. Have you got any tips for managers, directors of teams as to ways of us to deal with that?
I could make suggestions. I think you have to work out the flavour of your team. You know, what do people warm to? But I do know teams at the moment that are starting things like lunchtime yoga sessions or lunchtime meditation sessions, or just lunchtime, let's have a chat together sessions. And you might ban work from that, or you might decide that work is the context. But I think, again, if we're thinking about practice on an individual level, how do you practice that well-being of a team on a group level? You know, how do you take care of your team that enables them to, because they're almost like an organism in themselves, aren't they? You know, sort of how your team functions is a bit like, well, how are you looking after that entity? So I would say definitely giving time, you know, not just functional sort of planning meetings, but, you know, well-being style meetings. The purpose is to have that cup of tea, to have that let down moment. Maybe it's at the end of the week, maybe it's daily if you have time for that. But the reality is, in busy teams, that's not likely. And I think also fostering, developing a way of being in managers or leaders in teams, of not becoming defensive to problems, you know, not reacting defensively. This isn't about you, this is about what needs to happen. So it's about looking beyond the problem and saying, what does it need to be about, rather than sitting in it and going, oh my God, this is happening, how have I let this? Or thinking beyond and allowing people to also bring their creativity in to see how things might change.
What do you think about gender differences when it comes to mental toughness? Do you think there's a little bit of difference?
I think if we're thinking about resilience, there is a variation in terms of male and female resilience, because often our sociocultural experiences are different. But if we're thinking about how women are sort of in business or in high-powered jobs, I think it's really challenging, because what we recognise is that a lot of women, there is more perfectionism and more imposter syndrome in women at the moment, as we see it, than there is in men. We might ask ourselves what that's about socioculturally. You know, were women brought up not to think of themselves so much as leaders? You know, are they brought up maybe to be thought of as nurturers? You know, so we become much more interested in how somebody else is feeling, and then naturally become much more concerned about what they're thinking about us. I can't remember the last time, other than in therapy when I'm dealing with significant issues for a man, but I don't know any men in my family or in my friendship group that have ever said to me how, at the same level as female friends, how much they worry about what others think of them.
Yeah.
You know, so I think it can be a significant obstacle, and it's definitely a significant obstacle to the building of resilience, because resilience is about bounce back. It's about saying, I have experienced adversity, but actually I'm going to bounce back and become strong, if not stronger than before. And actually, if you think about that thought process of the imposter or the perfectionist, it's very hindering to that bounce back experience. You know, we would rather not go there again than experience that sense of failure or humiliation as we perceive it.
Chris, I would like to thank you for your time. Is there anything else you want to say?
No, this is an area of passion for me. You know, what I really want to see is people being able to live their best lives and stop giving themselves a hard time for being the particular kinds of people that they are. You know, everything about us is us. So how do we work with that and really bring out the best? There's some thunder happening in the background. I don't know if you can hear it on the screen. Very dramatic. Yeah, just to be the best that we can be, to live lives worth living, you know, and not to spend our life until we get to the end of it worrying so much about getting that little tiny detail or worrying what somebody else will think of us, but really being passionate and enjoying the skills that we have.
Well, thank you very much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.